The salesman laughed at me. Not behind my back. Not quietly. Right there in front of me. He looked me up and down. My old army jacket. My worn-out boots. The frayed cuffs on my sleeves. And then he glanced over at another salesman nearby and said, loud enough for me to hear, "Don't waste your time with this guy." A couple people standing near the showroom actually looked over when he said it. And the crazy part? I hadn't come into that dealership to browse. I was there to buy a car. Actually, 3 cars. In cash. But I didn't say any of that. I just stood there smiling slightly, like I hadn't heard him at all. Because at that exact moment, I noticed someone else walking across the showroom floor. The manager. Middle-aged guy. Suit and tie. Moving fast. At first, he looked irritated. Probably because he thought there was some kind of problem happening near the entrance. But then he got close enough to see the paperwork in the salesman's hand. And more importantly, close enough to read the name written at the top of the form. My name. The second he saw it, his entire expression changed. Completely. The irritation disappeared. His eyes widened slightly. And suddenly, the whole showroom got very quiet. Then he looked directly at the salesman and said, "Stay right here." Not loud. Not angry. But in the kind of tone that makes people nervous immediately. Welcome to Proven Right Stories. If you're new here, go ahead and subscribe. And maybe grab a coffee for this one. Because this story, it stays with you. Let's get into it. My name is Thomas Ward. I'm 62 years old. And before I tell you what happened inside that dealership on a Tuesday afternoon in March, there's something you should probably understand about me first. Something I don't usually tell people the first time I meet them. I served in the United States Army for 24 years. I enlisted when I was 18, shipped out at 19, and by the time I finally came home for good, I was 42 years old. In those 24 years, I served in 2 wars, held a rank I'm still not permitted to discuss publicly, and carried things that don't show up on medical records, discharge papers, or the outside of a man's face. Now, I'm not telling you any of this because I want sympathy. Most soldiers I know don't want sympathy. We just want people to understand that some things leave marks you can't always see. And the reason I'm telling you this now is because what happened in that dealership only really makes sense if you understand who I actually was underneath that old army jacket. I grew up in Macon, Georgia. Small house, quiet neighborhood, the kind of town where people still waved from front porches. My father was a Baptist minister for 38 years. Same church, same congregation, corner of Vine and Spring Street. And in all those years, I don't think he missed a single Sunday service. My mother worked for the county school board. Officially, she was an administrative assistant. Unofficially, she was the woman who actually kept the entire place running while 3 different administrators rotated through pretending they knew what they were doing. We weren't rich, but we weren't struggling either. We were the kind of family that believed if you gave your word, you kept it. You paid your bills. You treated people right. And you never asked for something you hadn't earned yourself. I enlisted in the Army the summer after I graduated high school. First person in my family to ever wear a uniform. I still remember the day my father drove me to the recruitment office. Didn't say much during the drive. Just parked the car, walked me to the front door, and shook my hand like I was already a man. Then he looked me in the eye and said 4 words I've carried with me ever since. He said, "Make it mean something." And honestly, I've thought about those 4 words almost every day of my life since then. I'm not going to walk you through all 24 years of my military service in detail. Not because those years don't matter. Because they matter too much to reduce down to a few dramatic stories and a paragraph on the internet. What I can tell you is this. I came home for good in 2004. I was 42 years old. I had a service-related back injury that eventually required surgery. A pension I'd earned the hard way. And a very specific set of skills that turned out to be surprisingly valuable in the civilian world. Crisis management, high-pressure decision-making, logistics coordination for complicated operations where timing mattered and mistakes cost people money. Or worse, one of my former commanding officers connected me with a private firm in Atlanta that needed exactly those kinds of skills. I worked there for about 3 years. And then eventually, I started my own company. Security, consulting, and logistics support for federal contractors. Now, I'm not going to sit here and throw revenue numbers at you, because I've never believed money makes a person more interesting. But I will tell you this. The company grew faster than I expected. A lot faster. And honestly, there were moments where it felt less like I was controlling the growth, and more like I was trying to keep up with it. By the time this story happened, late March, About 14 years after I started the company, we had more than 200 employees, 3 regional offices, and enough federal contracts to place us among the larger veteran-owned businesses in Georgia. And despite all of that, my life still looked pretty simple from the outside. I still drove the same truck I bought back in 2007. Still wore the same old army jacket when the weather got cold. Still got my hair cut at the same little barbershop on Peachtree Street. Same barber too. A guy named Calvin who'd been cutting my hair for 16 years. Every single time I sat down in his chair, he'd start the conversation the exact same way. He'd throw the cape over me and say, "So, what did you do lately that was worth telling about?" And every single time, I gave him the same kind of answers. I told him about my dog, my garden, a book I was reading. Never contracts, never business, never money. Some people hear that kind of life and assume a man doesn't have much going on. And honestly, that's the exact same mistake the salesman made that Tuesday afternoon. See, I needed 3 vehicles, 1 truck for myself, and 2 fleet vehicles for a new regional office we were opening in Birmingham. Nothing flashy, nothing expensive just for the sake of being expensive. Just reliable vehicles that could do the job. I'd actually called the dealership ahead of time, a large Ford dealership north of Atlanta, and spoken with somebody in their fleet department before coming in. But apparently, the fleet team was unavailable when I arrived. I walked into the dealership around 2:15 on a Tuesday afternoon. Old army jacket, gray work pants, worn boots, no tie, no expensive watch, no briefcase, nothing about me that screamed money. A salesman approached me within about a minute. Young guy, maybe 26, 27 years old. His name tag said Kyle. Sharp suit, perfect hair, that polished dealership smile people practice in mirrors. And he had that very specific kind of confidence some people develop when they think they've figured out how to judge a person within 5 seconds of looking at them. He asked if I needed help. I told him I was interested in looking at F-150s. He nodded and immediately launched into the beginning of a sales pitch. But before he got very far, another salesman walked past us, another young guy in an expensive suit, and as he passed, he muttered something quietly to Kyle. Quiet, but not quiet enough. He said, "That one's not buying today." Kyle glanced over at me for half a second. Then he smiled. Not at me. The other kind of smile. The kind people use when they think they're sharing a joke. And then he said, "Yeah, let me wrap this up." I heard every word. And the thing about spending 24 years in military environments is this. You learn very quickly that missing quiet conversations can have serious consequences. So no, I don't miss much. But I didn't react. Didn't get angry. Didn't confront him. I simply kept my expression neutral. Walked over to a display model on the showroom floor. And waited. Kyle came back a minute later with a completely different energy. Not rude anymore. But not warm either. The fake enthusiasm had dropped by about 30%. You could almost see the calculation happening in real time. He'd mentally moved me into a different category. Not a serious buyer. Just someone he needed to process quickly so he could get back to customers he thought actually mattered. So now he was in efficiency mode. He walked me over to a basic Model F-150, started pointing out standard features, and asked what kind of budget I was working with. I told him I was looking at purchasing 3 vehicles. That got his attention immediately. He looked at me for a second, and I could practically watch the math happening behind his eyes. Then he said, 3 vehicles? I nodded. 2 fleet vehicles. 1 personal. He blinked. All today. I said, that's the plan. And just like that, everything about him shifted again. His posture straightened. His voice changed. Suddenly, there was a new brochure in his hand. And now he was talking to me like I actually existed. I watched the transformation happen in real time. And honestly, I didn't feel offended. Didn't feel impressed either. Because respect that only appears when money enters the conversation isn't respect. It's inventory management. Kyle handed me an intake form and asked me to fill out the basic information. Name, business, contact details. I wrote my name across the top. Thomas R. Ward. Then I handed the clipboard back to him. And that was the moment everything changed. A manager had just stepped out of an office nearby. I'd later learn his name was Dennis Park. Mid-40s, dark suit, calm face. The kind of man who'd clearly spent years running dealership floors and could spot problems the second they appeared. At first, he seemed distracted, probably handling paperwork, approvals, something routine. Kyle held the intake form out toward him. Dennis took it casually, looked down at the page, and froze. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. He read my name once, then again, and from across the showroom floor. I watched his entire expression change. He looked up slowly, directly at me, and it wasn't the normal look people give customers. It was the look someone gives when they recognize a name they never expected to see standing in front of them. Dennis crossed the showroom floor fast, maybe 10 seconds. Before I even had time to fully turn toward him, he was already extending his hand. And the first thing he said was, "Mr. Ward, I'm Dennis Park." Then he glanced briefly toward Kyle before looking back at me, and his tone became noticeably more serious. He said, "I want to apologize for how you were greeted today. That is not how we operate here." Out of the corner of my eye, I could see Kyle standing perfectly still now. No smile, no confidence, just silence. I shook Dennis's hand and said, "I appreciate that." Dennis nodded once, and then said something that surprised me a little. He said, "I'm familiar with your company. I actually have a family member who works through one of your regional programs. He's been with you for about 4 years now." I looked at him for a second, then said, "Well, then he's probably one of the good ones. We tend to hold on to those." That almost made Dennis smile. Almost. But then he remembered Kyle was still standing there beside him, and the expression shifted back into something more controlled, professional, measured. Then Dennis looked at me and said, "Would you mind if we started over? I'd like to personally take care of you from here." And I told him, "Yeah, I'd appreciate that." Before Dennis and I walked away, I said something to Kyle that I honestly haven't repeated to many people since. Because this part of the story was never really about embarrassing him, and it definitely wasn't about revenge. I stopped for a second, turned back toward him, and looked him directly in the eye. He still hadn't said much. Honestly, he looked stunned, and I said to him quietly, not angry, not dramatic, just honest, "Son, you made a decision about me within the first 4 seconds after I walked through that door." I paused for a moment. Then I said, "You know it, and I know it." The showroom had gotten very quiet by then. I could tell Kyle expected me to humiliate him in front of everyone, but that wasn't what I wanted. So I told him, "I'm not angry about it. People judge each other. That's human nature. We all do it." Then I looked down briefly at the intake form still sitting in his hand before looking back at him again. And I said, "But I want you to understand something from a man who's been around a little longer than you have. The people worth the most, in every possible meaning of that phrase, rarely look the way you expect them to." Kyle didn't move, didn't interrupt. So I continued, "Your job is to help people, not decide who deserves your help before you've even given them 30 seconds. Then I nodded once and said, "That's all." And honestly, that really was all. I didn't need an apology from him, didn't need guilt, didn't need him to feel ashamed, because life teaches lessons eventually, one way or another. Dennis and I spent the next 2.5 hours together that afternoon, and I'll give the man credit. He was very good at his job, not because he could spot wealthy customers, because he actually understood the business. He knew the inventory, knew the fleet pricing, understood logistics, and treated the process professionally from beginning to end, the way a good salesman is supposed to. Eventually, we settled on 3 vehicles, 2 F-250 fleet trucks for the Birmingham office, and 1 F-150 for me. Simple, practical, exactly what I came there for. We finalized the numbers, agreed on the terms, and then I reached into my jacket and wrote the check. Not financing, not a deposit, the full amount, all at once. I handed the check across the desk to Dennis, and I remember him looking down at it for a second longer than most people probably would have. Like, even after everything, part of him still hadn't expected the number to be that high. Then he looked back up at me and said, "Mr. Ward, can I tell you something?" I told him to go ahead. He leaned back slightly in his chair and said, "My brother served in the Marines, 2 tours overseas." Then his expression shifted a little, more personal, more honest. He said, "He came home about 3 years ago, and I think he's still trying to figure out what comes next." I nodded, because I knew exactly what he meant. Dennis continued, "I see veterans come through here pretty often. Some people treat them well. Some people." He stopped himself before finishing the sentence. Then he shook his head slightly and said, "I'm sorry today started the way it did." And I remember telling him something I genuinely hope he repeated to his brother later. I said, "Dennis, the way it started wasn't your fault. And the fact that you handled it the way you did, that matters." Then I said, "Tell your brother something for me. The figuring it out part takes as long as it takes. And that's okay." Dennis listened carefully, so I kept going. The things we carry home from service. They're not problems to solve. They're weight. And over time, you just learn how to distribute that weight across a long life. Dennis got quiet after that. Just sat there holding on to the words for a moment. Then eventually, he nodded once and said, "Thank you." And as I stood up to leave, I told him one last thing. I said, "Take care of your people. That's all any of us can really do." I've thought about that afternoon quite a few times since then. But honestly, not because of Kyle, and not because of the money, or the trucks, or the dealership. The part that stayed with me the most was Dennis Park talking about his brother. Because if you've served long enough, you eventually realize something most people never really think about. Coming home is its own kind of mission, and sometimes it's the hardest one. You spend years inside a world where everything has structure, clear objectives, clear responsibilities, clear purpose. You always know where you're supposed to be, what's expected of you, who depends on you. And then one day, that structure disappears. Nobody's giving orders anymore. Nobody's calling for you over the radio. Nobody's depending on your decisions in the same way. And suddenly, you're standing in a grocery store, or sitting in traffic, or walking through a dealership, trying to figure out who you're supposed to be now. That adjustment takes longer than people think. A lot longer. I've thought about that conversation with Dennis because I know there are thousands of veterans walking around carrying that same invisible weight every single day. People see the jacket, or the gray hair, or the quiet personality, and they think they understand the man standing in front of them. Most of the time, they don't. And honestly, this story made me think about something my father told me 44 years ago when he dropped me off at that recruitment office. For words, make it mean something. I've tried to live by that ever since. Not through rank, not through money, not through titles, or trucks, or whatever number happens to be sitting in a bank account, but through how I treat people, especially the people who don't expect kindness anymore. The people who've spent so long being ignored, dismissed, or underestimated, that they've slowly started believing they're supposed to stay invisible. Those are the people who matter most to me now. And if you served, if you came home from military service, and you've spent years trying to figure out how to carry everything you brought back with you, I want you to hear me clearly. You are not behind. You are not weak. And you are not broken just because the adjustment is taking longer than someone promised you it would. Some things take time. The figuring it out part takes as long as it takes. And that's okay. And if someone you love is going through that right now, a veteran, a parent, a friend, anybody quietly carrying more weight than they let people see, you don't always need the perfect words. Most people aren't looking for speeches. They just want to know somebody sees them, really sees them. Sometimes that alone is enough. More than enough. And before I go, let me ask you something. Have you ever walked into a place, a store, an office, a restaurant, anywhere, and felt yourself being judged before you even spoke? Like somebody had already decided who you were within the first few seconds of looking at you? Tell me about it in the comments. Because this happens every single day. To good people, to hardworking people, to people carrying things nobody else can see. And if this story reminded you of someone, a veteran, a father, a mother, a friend, or anybody who's spent their life being underestimated by people who never took 30 seconds to truly look at them, send this story to them. Because some people spend their entire lives being dismissed by strangers, who never had the patience to find out who they were actually talking to. I'll see you in the next one.